This is Classical Ideas with Greg Soden. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. My guest today is Shulem Deen. His biography at shulemdeen.com reads, Shulem Deen is the author of the award-winning memoir, All Who Go Do Not Return, an account of living within and then leaving New York's Skoverror Hasidic community. He is a regular contributor to The Forward, and in 2015 was listed in the Forward 50, an annual list of American Jews with outsized roles on political and social issues. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, Salon, Tablet magazine, and elsewhere. He serves as a board member at Footsteps, a New York City-based organization that offers assistance and support to those who have left the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. This was a powerful and challenging conversation for me. I absolutely loved, admired, was devastated, and inspired by Shulem's book, so I was a little nervous and very thrilled to talk to Shulem. I cannot stress enough how much I think you should read this book about his life living in New Square, New York, in an insular Hasidic community. One of my favorite things about this conversation was it heightened my connection to the book, and this conversation is not a substitute for reading the book itself. We did not retell the narratives found within the book, so there are very few spoilers to be found in the conversation. I hope this chat gets you excited about his book, which won the National Jewish Book Award by the Jewish Book Council. So without further delay, here's my conversation with Shulem Deen. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. I'm here today with my guest, Shulem Deen, author of the memoir, All Who Go Do Not Return. Shulem, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I want to start off today by talking about the first day that I emailed you, and I received a fantastic auto reply that I loved, and there's a few fascinating quotes that you have in your email auto reply. And the first is, if this is to tell me you disagree with me, I thank you for that too, although regretfully I must decline email debates. The second is, if this is to tell me how sad or sorry or heartbroken you are for me, I appreciate that. So these email lines were amazing to me because since you have this as an auto reply, you must get a lot of things related to this. So can you tell me a little bit about the normal day in your correspondence as an ex-Hasidic Skoverror? And because I found this auto reply immensely fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I put that in soon after my book came out. I was just getting overwhelmed with emails, and it was impossible to respond to them all. But you know, you have a book out there, people read your story and they connect with your message and they feel like they know you. And I felt like there should be some acknowledgement of the email that came in, even if I wasn't able to respond to every person who wrote. And I wasn't able. It's just not by temperament, I just cannot just shoot a quick reply to every person who emails me when it comes in at that volume. And so I sort of found some ways to categorize them, and I found the ones that I truly appreciated, and then I found the ones that sort of annoyed me a little bit. And so, you know, I am actually, I'd like to hear from people who disagree with me, but I just can't go on and on in back and forth email debates, and that's something that there were some readers who wanted to do that. So that was for them, and there was one particular reaction that I got a lot from my book, and I still get, and that is, I feel so sorry for you. And I think that reaction is understandable, especially in the way that I chose to end my book. I chose to end my book at a point where you feel really like this story has not been resolved well. You feel like this story has been resolved. It ends in tragedy, pretty much. And I think that many people came away feeling that the condition that I write about at the end of my book, that is the condition I live with now, which is not really the case. I started writing the book in 2010. That's when I conceived of the narrative arc. That's when I thought about how I was going to tell this story. And, right now it's 8 years after I began writing. And even when the book came out, it was 5 years after. And I was not in that place that I write, that I describe myself at the end of the book. And I chose that ending because that felt the truest ending. And even though, I'd gone on to do some things, and I live a fairly happy life. We all have good days and bad days, but I have a strong social network and lots of friends and things like that. But I felt like none of that really would make for a proper resolution of the story I tell, because the story I tell really ends in devastation, and I felt like it had to end at that point. But then readers thought that that's where I was, and I would get emails like, "I feel so sorry for you. Are you still, if you ever still feel lonely, we'd love to have you for Friday night Shabbat dinner," things like that. And it kind of annoyed me to some degree that readers didn't have that awareness that writers are not necessarily the exact same person that they read about. And so I felt, let me put this to good use. And so I thought, let me tell all these people who feel that sorry about me, to actually channel that feeling to support an organization that I feel really strongly about. I feel strongly about its mission, and that's an organization called Footsteps, which provides assistance to people who've left the ultra-Orthodox world. And so that was my way of trying to urge people away from the focus on feeling so sorry for me and into actually doing something to help people.
Nice. So we're going to get into so many of the things that you just talked about. But before we do that, I want to get some terminology and some basics out of the way, because there were so many new concepts to me in this book.
Right.
And so 12 years ago, you left an ultra-Orthodox and insular sect of Hasidic Judaism called the Skoverrors.
Right.
Who are the Skoverrors?
Well, the Skoverrors are a sect within Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic Judaism is a movement that it sort of got its start in the 18th century Poland, or what is now the Ukraine, and then spread very quickly across Eastern Europe into the areas where Jews live, the Pale of Settlement in particular, and even further west into Hungary and Czechoslovakia and parts of Austria. And so as the movement developed, it broke off into different sects that were headed by leaders from different towns. And because Jews were so spread out geographically, they couldn't all come to one master who lived in one place in Poland. And so this concept of different groups, different groups following certain Hasidic leaders, that sort of came out of this. And so you have different sects that were built around that sort of diversification. And so the Skoverrors are just one sect, and every sect has its own sort of distinguishing characteristics. And the Skoverra sect today, post-Holocaust, after they sort of rebuilt in the United States, they are known for their insularity, and they're known for well, or at least they themselves think that they are the closest bearers of the Hasidic tradition. The leader of the Skoverra sect is a direct descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of the Hasidic movement, and so the Skoverros have this idea of authenticity about themselves. The broader Hasidic world doesn't necessarily share that. What they do think is that these people have really isolated themselves in a way that goes further than what most Hasidic sects have done. Although most Hasidic sects now do live in sort of a self-imposed isolation to some degree. But the Skoverros just took that a step further.
So how do they compare to the other groups that you talk about in the book, like the Lubavitchers, the Satmars, the Breslovs? Is there any like competition or distrust among these groups?
Well, I would say the Hasidic world generally is characterized by a mainstream and then by a couple of sort of separate Hasidic movements. So the mainstream are what is sort of just, how would I describe this? Sort of run-of-the-mill Hasidim, which is, they're the Satmars, they're the Skoverrors, they're the Vishnitzers, they're the Belzers. They all pretty much dress the same. They have similar worldviews, similar ideologies, and they're probably somewhere between, I think they're about 350,000 in the New York City area, maybe more, maybe less. It's hard to know exactly the numbers, but that's an estimate that some demographers have come up with. Then there are certain Hasidic sects that I would almost define them as separate Hasidic movements, and that includes the Chabad, also known as Lubavitchers, as well as the Breslov. I think both of them, particularly the Lubavitchers, the Chabad, are very different from the mainstream Hasidic community in that they're outward focused. They're into outreach. Many people, when they think of Hasidim, actually think of Chabad because those are the ones they come in contact with. Chabad sets up Chabad synagogues all over the world. There is a Chabad in almost every town in the United States. There's a Chabad in almost every country throughout the world. So in that way, they're very different. The other groups, the Skoverrors, the Satmars, the Vishnitzers, the Belzers, retreat into their own little enclaves and want nothing to do with the outside world.
That's really interesting. I do have a very good friend of mine in this town that I live in who is Chabad. He's the Chabad rabbi here in my city.
Right.
And he's always engaged. He's in the newspaper. He's doing he's working in the student union. He's doing all kinds of outreach work.
Right. Yes. They're definitely on college campuses. Almost every college campus has a Chabad, or at least, every sort of major college has a Chabad presence of some kind.
So, on the other hand, there's this term in the book that I think a lot of people will be interested in, and that is Goyim. Who are Goyim, and why does this term matter?
Well, Goyim, it's just it's the Yiddish word for non-Jew. I mean, it's originally Hebrew. It means nations, and it essentially means the nations of the world as opposed to the Jewish people. But Jews have had how do we put it, a somewhat complicated relationship with the Gentile world. Mm-hmm. And, historically, Jews have seen the non-Jewish world as threatening. This is not just true of Hasidic Jews. This is true of Jews across the board until, fairly recently when Jews are now living quite comfortably, I would say, in the United States. And one can argue that, at least in the U.S., while there might be some anti-Semitism, the U.S. is not an anti-Semitic society. The U.S. is a society in which Jews have done exceptionally well, probably better than they've done in history, ever. And coupled with the fact that now there's a Jewish state of Israel, which is also historically unprecedented, the Jewish relationship to non-Jews has sort of changed, but in more traditional circles, the relationship between Jews and non-Jews still has that sort of medieval quality. It sort of still has that suspicion, that fear of the non-Jewish world. And so this is not, I would say, an ideological, so much an ideological point as much of a something born of history.
Gotcha. Now, in the book, I get the impression that there is a sense of suspicion for outside Goyim in places like New Square, where you lived for many years. Are many Hasidic children who are raised in these insular environments raised to believe that Goyim hate Jews or hate Hasids? Is that a pretty common thing?
Oh, certainly. Certainly, and I would qualify the fact that what I said about Jews being fairly comfortable in the United States. I think that is true. I do think that there is tremendous hostility towards ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I think that some might call that anti-Semitism. It's certainly not the kind of anti-Semitism that is directed broadly towards the entire Jewish world, But growing up as a Hasidic person, the idea that anti-Semitism doesn't exist in America would have been completely astounding to me, because we encountered what we thought was anti-Semitism all the time, because there was tremendous hostility. And so our attitude towards Goyim was, there would be young teenagers from surrounding areas, surrounding neighborhoods, and they'd come drive through the village and just try to cause trouble and be hostile. And so that's where that feeling develops. And so when you develop that kind of distrust and that kind of fear of the outsider, it sort of turns into an ideological point, and there is some basis for having that ideological point within Judaism. And so that gets reinforced by the attitudes that people see.
So I want to linger on that for a second. So in your book, All Who Go Do Not Return, you describe a terrifying moment, and for me, I was like riveted reading this. And the section of the book is whenever a car of bigoted kids drove through New Square, almost ran you over, and then you rounded up like a mob of folks by yelling "shkuzim," which means vermin, right? Did I say that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, a shagetz is the masculine term for a non-Jew. The feminine term is somewhat more well-known. It is shiksa. And so shagetz is the male equivalent of shiksa. And the plural of shagetz is shkutzim in Yiddish.
Gotcha.
And so shkutzim, basically, it comes from the Hebrew term vermin, but it's generally, it is a Yiddish word, really, that means either non-Jew or a Jew who has gone so far off from the tradition that he too has become a shagetz.
So when this car like almost ran you over and you rounded up a group of people, so the car is trapped in your village, and right. The car charges and the mob causes the car to crash. So in the moment, it was very powerful on both sides. It seemed powerful on your side because you were like in this like group mentality of this intruder. So what stands out to you all these years later about that day, and what do you think the major lessons for people might be in a moment such as that?
Well, I actually struggled to find a reason to include that in the book. It was a very disturbing incident in hindsight. In the moment, it was disturbing in the moment because it felt threatening. It felt like, here are people who are here to hurt us. Later, I think I reflected on that. And I remembered that night in particular. It was a holiday, and I remember thinking about what makes us different from them. I was somewhat disturbed at the gleefulness that I witnessed at the car crash. Because these kids were clearly very hurt. They got really badly beat up by their car crash, and I thought, okay, they were clearly kids who were trying to cause trouble, but I didn't quite have the feeling that they deserved that. I had the feeling that, okay, they got themselves into a pickle that they shouldn't have, and maybe that was something that not quite they had coming, but they could have expected that. But I was not happy with the way people felt so indifferent to the fact that there were teenagers here who were actually injured and had to be hospitalized. And I don't know to what degree they were injured. I don't know. I never found out whether anyone was in serious condition or anything like that. My general sort of assumption is that they were not seriously injured because we probably would have heard about it. But that may or may not be correct. But I was really troubled by the notion that we considered them to be so almost non-human. And that really bothered me.
Do you find any irony in that?
Irony in what way?
In the fact that, for so many thousands of years, the world has been so threatening to the Jewish community, and so is your response like a defensiveness against the thousands of years of history that have kind of like built up in the community?
Well, my response was simply, it wasn't from a particular superior moral or ethical position. It was more, it had something to do with how I was raised, and I was raised with parents who did not come from within the Hasidic tradition. They came from the more secular Jewish world and had joined the Hasidic world. And I had always been raised by my parents to actually see non-Jews in ways that were different from the way the community generally saw them. The Hasidic community is generally very sort of hostile, or it returns the favor of the non-Jewish world being sort of showing it such hostility. But I was not raised by my parents to believe that way, and that had a lasting and powerful impact. And so when this happened, I think that my reaction to these kids getting so hurt was very different from the reaction of most people in the community.
So what was your day-to-day life like? So obviously this car crash is like an out of the ordinary day. So what was an ordinary day like for you living in New Square?
Well, ordinary day in New Square is pretty much like ordinary day everywhere. You worry about rent and making your car payments and paying the electric bill and raising your kids and finding a job, which was it's always a very substantial concern, especially since Hasidic men don't receive much secular education, and so they have very limited marketable skills, and so that became a big issue, especially when you have to raise a large family. You're taught to that raising large families is important. It's probably one of the most supreme values within the Hasidic community. The centrality of family. And so on the one hand, they emphasize that, but on the other, there's a lack of training for the workforce. And so that was a sort of a perennial anxiety until ultimately, I went to the library and fast forward in the story, I taught myself computer programming and actually had a career as a computer programmer for about a decade. But that would come later.
So it seems really hard to make a living in the town, and I noticed that there was quite a prevalence of people leaving on buses to go into New York City to work every day. Is that pretty common?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, how do people work like in the village? Like, what are the common professions like in the town?
Well, professions would be, I wouldn't quite call them professions. People just find work as entrepreneurs. People find work in low-skilled jobs. People are bus drivers. People are, people work in stores, in supermarkets, and whatever other stores there might be. And it's sort of it's to a large degree, it's a very self-contained economy. Most of what's earned stays within the community. There's some that comes from the outside, and so there are the buses that go to New York City. But even the ones that go to New York City, largely Hasidic Jews are employed by either other Hasidic Jews or other ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jews. For Hasidic Jews to work in a completely secular company is not unheard of, but it's fairly unusual.
So I went on YouTube and found some clips of folks walking through New Square, and they would like walk past like a yeshiva, and people would scream out the window, "Get out of here!" And that reverberated strongly with me because I grew up in a fairly segregated place in St. Louis in the Midwest. And New Square kind of gave off that segregated vibe. And I was just curious if now that you're not a part of the community, if you ever happen to like drive through there, like what it feels like now that you're an outsider going to a place that seems so inward looking.
Well, I know the place intimately. And so when I drive through there, which nowadays is not very often, but when I do, if I do have occasion to drive through there, I never feel I never feel threatened. There's never that kind of feeling that I better be careful because I'm an outsider. I think because I know the parameters of what can get you in trouble, and you have to do something that is fairly overtly antagonistic to actually have something happen to you. And New Square is filled with people from the outside that come in day to day to do work there. I mean, there's certainly there are construction workers who come in to build the houses. There are every public building or every all the institutions employ janitors, and mostly these are people from the outside. Mostly, many of them are immigrants, whether from Central America and other places like that. The people who do the kind of low-skilled work that or the kind of low-wage work that you see all over wherever you go, those are the people who do the low-wage work in New Square as well. And so, no one gives them any trouble. It's not. It's not really the case that if you walk in and you're not from there, you will encounter trouble. It's almost always, if there is something that instigated it. I don't know the particular YouTube video you're referring to. I would actually be curious to see it, but there's probably a backstory there.
So I want to talk a little bit about relationships now. While I was reading the book, I was very moved by the stunningly awkward descriptions of like sex and relationships and how you were counseled into your marriage. And I don't think I've ever read anything more painfully awkward than the experience that you had at 18 as a newly married man.
Right.
And while you were stumbling through like learning about sex, you were being counseled by your elders that a wife isn't a friend. So what does reflecting about moments like this mean to you now about like relationships and growing up and the world?
Well, I should say first that, that is not necessarily, the way I was counseled was not necessarily the norm, which is not to say that it was unusual. It was not unusual at all. But there are plenty of people who are counseled differently, and much of it has to do with your individual mentor. In my case, I think I knew from a very, very early period that this marriage was not good for me, and so I think that he had no choice, or he felt kind of sort of that he had nothing to say except, your concerns are not valid concerns because here's a theological or ideological principle, and so don't worry about that because that's not the point. It's not quite true that husbands and wives are not meant to be friends. I think there are many very healthy relationships, and I think relationship dynamics within the Hasidic world, I mean, they certainly vary from couple to couple, and certainly the quality of having an arranged marriage will affect how people will relate to each other. But so having said that, thinking about how that affected me later on, what's funny is I had this conversation once. I was being interviewed by someone at an event, and she said to me, what do I think about the system of arranged marriages in the Hasidic community? And I said, I think it's problematic, but I think, the system that the outside world has, I think, is filled with problems too. It's filled with, pitfalls, and it's not completely smooth sailing. And she said to me, what do you mean the system? We don't have a system. And that really struck me as it was really fascinating to me that she hadn't realized that the secular world, or however you want to term the world outside of the very religious community, has a system too. People don't just go over to someone and say, I want to marry, and then next day they're married. there are courtship rituals and mating rituals, and there is a process. You ask someone out, you ask them out for a drink, you ask them out for dinner, you take it step by step and things like that. So of course there's a system. It's just not scripted in the same way. And so I think that coming from that world into this world where I had to deal with things like dating, getting into relationships, being in relationships with people, they're definitely something that it makes me think about the world that I came from and how relationships were formed in that world and how they're formed in the world outside of it. I think relationships in the Hasidic community are formed with the kind of consciousness and intentionality that we in the broader world, the secular world, have generally dismissed as unhelpful to us, as going counter to our philosophies of individualism. And I think to a certain extent we lose something, which is not to argue that the entire world should adopt Hasidic methods for marriage and things like that. But I do think that there's something somewhat unhealthy in the way we go about forming relationships, or the way I go about forming relationships now as a secular person. I've been out for 10 years, and I've had some short-term relationships and some longer relationships, and I think that there's a quality of wanting it all and wanting the perfect person and looking for that perfect person that, frankly, we all know does not exist. There is no perfect person. Perfection does not exist in the human world. And I think that because we're so focused on ourselves and pleasing ourselves and so focused on our individual happiness, I think we lose something in the illusion that we could really have everything we want.
I do think it's really interesting how we can describe the outside world, like the system that I grew up in, as being a system in and of itself, because if you don't ever think of it like a system and you're only ever looking at other communities, then you think that your way is like the default. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
So you don't think of it as a system. Right.
Although I do. So I guess that's what I have coming out of that world is I see them both as systems. Because I've had to learn that, okay, things work differently here. And now, how do I approach this? I've had to learn the rules in my 30s. How do you ask a woman out on a date? What is the process? How do you do it? How do you what are the rules? What are the what do people expect of you? What are the faux pas to avoid? These are things that really require learning. And when you grow up in an environment where it's what everyone is doing, you kind of learn it with everyone else. I suppose. I haven't been through it, but from observation, this is what it would seem to me that kids go through school, they go through high school, and they get involved with each other, or they don't, but they're looking for it, and they see how their peers are doing it. And so you sort of naturally you get acclimated to how this works and what are the norms within the broader society. But I didn't have that, and so I had to actually study it.
So one of my favorite things in the book was watching your journey out. So you just mentioned learning new rules and learning new ideas. And you have some really, really beautiful moments with some people in the book, a list of characters. And one of my favorite is when you were being helped by the librarian at the public library, and you were a black hat Hasid with payas, and you were sitting in the kids section. What kind of refuge did you find within literature in the months and years after your departure from New Square?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think literature stood out for me as a source of comfort in a particularly primary way. I think where I found what I found most meaningful in my life after leaving New Square was in human relationships, in romantic relationships, in friendships, in the broader community that I am now part of, which is sort of a community of former ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I sort of belong to a sort of smaller writing community that is nurturing to me and that is important, and I formed very meaningful friendships from there. Literature, literature has its place for me in the same way that all art has its place for me. I mean, I am more an ideas person than a visual person, if that makes any sense, and so I am more drawn to reading than going to an art museum. I'm more drawn to storytelling. That may not be true, but I'm more drawn to ideas than to sort of observing abstract things, and so in that sense, literature, film, general storytelling, journalism, philosophical works, books on history, books on science, those have all been fascinating, and they've contributed to my intellectual development. And to some degree, I hesitate to use this word, but I would say to some degree my spiritual development, although what I mean by spiritual exactly is something that I sometimes struggle to figure out. I'm sometimes cautious of the word spiritual because I don't actually... my worldview now is mostly materialistic, in the sense that I don't actually believe in supernatural forces. I don't buy into any ideas of any deities or anything like that. And so, but I mean spirituality. I mean it in the broadest sense of feeling connected to others and feeling sort of feeling uplifted by stories and by music and things like that.
I loved watching you connect with some of the characters in the book, notably Madi, who opened you up to the radio, Menashe, who you discussed the, quote, strange thoughts, or right. with Hesky, your movie buddy. Do you keep in touch with any of these folks? And, like, if so, what do you talk about? But if not, like, how do you feel towards their roles in you leaving the community?
Well, I mean, they were just a few of the many friends that I had within the Hasidic world, and I lost them the way I lost all the others for the most part. I do not keep in touch with them. I've not been in touch with them for many, many years, except for the character I call Menashe. I've run into him on occasion, at like a certain, a family wedding that I might be friends with someone he's related to, and I'd go to the wedding and things like that. He happens to also have a brother who has an important role in the story. His brother was the younger boy, Libby, whom I encouraged to go to college instead of, he just wanted to leave and run away, and his idea was to go to the army, and I kind of told him, maybe that's a good idea, but why don't you look into going to college? And that had never occurred to him, and so he looked into that, and he was very academically gifted, still is, and in the end he ended up leaving, and so he and I are still connected. We're good friends. He ended up going to Cornell and got a degree in biochemistry, and he works in a lab now and all that, and so he is the brother of the character Menashe, and so occasionally I'll run into the character Menashe because I'm friends with his younger brother who left. And so things like that. But other than that, I do not have connections with the people from that world. They've been almost totally severed.
And they're severed from you because you were labeled an apikoros. So what does it mean to be labeled an apikoros in the insular Hasidic world?
That's an interesting question. Apikoros is something that, in that world, they will, in general, in the Orthodox Jewish world, apikoros, which literally means heretic, is generally a term that people use to. There's a lot of weight given to that term, and there's this common notion within the Orthodox world that you can't be an apikoros unless you are exceptionally learned and exceptionally erudite in religious matters, in religious and philosophical matters. And so generally people will say, you're not learned enough to be an apikoros. They'll say you haven't studied enough Talmud to be able to reject it. You haven't studied enough of the biblical commentaries to be able to say whether you believe in the Bible's divine origin or not. And so claiming the term apikoros can sometimes seem, within that world, it's kind of grandiose.
Mm-hmm.
But I claimed it for myself because it was actually given to me. Because I was told by the rabbinical court, when they expelled me, that I am an apikoros, and they can't have an apikoros within this community. And so that kind of gave me, I would say, the permission to say, okay, well, you've called me that, and I'll own that term, because to me it's a term of honor. But it also comes with incredibly great costs. There are people who leave the Hasidic community, but they're not entirely cut off, because there's a sense that some people just, it doesn't work for them.
Okay, so because you were labeled an apikoros, that almost kind of like means that you are recognized as a genuine Talmudic scholar, so to speak?
Well, I don't know if I would go that far. I don't know if that is what they were trying to say. I think that what they were saying was, I am recognized as a genuine threat.
Gotcha.
As opposed to someone who just doesn't like the community and decides to leave. There's always this hope that they'll, one day they'll come back if you'll be really nice to them. Whereas I don't get that kind of treatment.
Gotcha. So what would you say to folks from like any community who are being shunned? Like, what do you wish someone who had been shunned from a community told you in your first months out in the world?
I don't know that there is that much that can be said for to prepare someone for the trauma of losing community in that way. I guess just to be warned that can be absolutely devastating. I was not prepared for the psychic trauma that I experienced after being expelled and leaving this community. I thought that this would not be a big deal because I no longer believe in the precepts that this community requires you to believe in, and so I thought, okay, so then I don't belong here. And I'd underestimated the degree to which the community was not only a place where you had to believe a certain way, but also a place of human relationships and human connection. And I lost all of those. And that was a truly, truly traumatic process.
So I'm curious. So like, let's dive out of the book now. What are some of your proudest accomplishments that you have had in the last 12 years? Like, what gets you out of bed these days?
Well, I identify primarily as a writer now, and I do a lot of writing. I think I left that community with the intention of becoming a writer. I didn't quite know what it would entail. I didn't quite know if that's even a realistic possibility. But there was something about writing that had always drawn me. I think there's something in my personality that requires writing for me to really formulate my thoughts properly. And so I'd wanted to be a novelist, and I had a novel in progress before I wrote this book. Still in progress. And I still get back to it from time to time. But one of the things an opportunity that came my way was to write a memoir. And originally I wasn't thrilled with the idea. I saw memoir as a genre. I saw it as kind of, the bastard child of literature. I wanted to write something with more gravitas, something that would actually be a literary accomplishment. And it took some time for me to become comfortable with the idea of memoir, aside from the fact that you have to be so self-revealing and put yourself out there to the public in ways that are not always so comfortable. I had to come to terms with the fact that memoir as a genre is an art form, and an art form that requires just as much discipline and skill as a novel. It's just a different form. And so when I had the opportunity to write a memoir, it took some time for me to get comfortable with the idea, but in the end I realized, okay, this is my way into the world of writing and publishing. And so for me, this was a literary project primarily. It was certainly not, I had no need to, quote, tell my story. I wanted to write a book, and I had an agent who thought that I could, if I could write a memoir, it would be something that publishers would be interested in. And the work that I did on this book was incredibly hard work. It's probably the hardest work that I'd ever done in my life. And I think I would say that truly is the greatest accomplishment, because it came with incredible difficulty.
And I know that you insisted on recording the audio for the book yourself, which I highly recommend to anybody out there. But what did you enjoy about doing the audio for it as well?
Well, first of all, I didn't realize quite the degree to which it is a performance as opposed to just reading. And so when I sat down in that recording studio the first time and realized that I had to do more than just read the pages, I had to put something into it. That was first a little daunting, and because I hadn't practiced, I didn't sit down at home and sort of rehearse how I was going to deliver it or anything like that, and it felt somewhat unsettling when I realized just how I thought I was somewhat unprepared, but then I got into it, and it was somewhat draining. I think I did the entire thing in about 5 sessions, and they were 5 hours each, and I probably had about a 30-minute break for most of them, somewhere in the middle, but they were fairly long stretches of recording. So that was it was an enjoyable experience, certainly, and interesting, not particularly noteworthy, but kind of fun.
So what do you do with the organization Footsteps?
So I serve on their board. I've been connected to them for a very long time now. I became a member of the organization in 2006, which was 2007, just shortly before I left, when I already had pretty much figured out that I was going to leave. I checked them out. I went to visit their space, and initially didn't really feel like I could get much out of the organization. It felt a little bit like they provide services to people who leave, like helping them get into college and helping them find jobs and helping them navigate, how to find housing and just how to be in the secular world. And I felt like I didn't quite need that level of hand-holding, because I had been out. I'd had a job as a computer programmer for 10 years in Midtown Manhattan, which sort of felt like, I felt kind of acclimated enough that I didn't need that kind of support. In the end, I realized that I actually did. First of all, I was not acclimated enough. There was a wealth of knowledge simply about human conduct and about just how people went about their lives that I had to learn. And so Footsteps actually formed a community for me that was absolutely vital in those early years. And so eventually I no longer needed the kind of support that I got from them, but the community that I had gained from being part of it was and remains now incredibly important. And I'm very passionate about their mission. I think they're pretty much the only organization in North America that exists to do this work. And so I now serve on the board as a board member, and I'm involved in the decision making, and we've grown tremendously. When I joined the board 6 years ago, we were a small organization with a 2.5 staff. We had 2 full-time staff members and 1 part-time. It was the executive director and a social worker, and then a sort of a part-time social worker as well. And now we're a staff of 15, and budget is literally 10 times as much as it was then. And I think the work we do is really vital and life-saving, literally.
What do you still love about Judaism?
It's hard to say. First of all, I differentiate Jewishness from Judaism. Judaism, I think, Judaism is the belief, the faith system, the faith tradition of Jews. But there are many Jews who don't particularly adopt the faith of Judaism, and so I generally consider myself to be culturally Jewish, but not particularly connected to the faith tradition. Although I have to say that culturally Jewish does also mean being connected to Judaism, and so that also means celebrating the holidays, even if it's not in a particularly religious way. And so, I'll never miss a good Hanukkah party, or a Purim party, or for most of the Jewish holidays, I celebrate it some way, even if only because so many people I know are doing holiday dinners or other sort of festivities, and so I take part because it's there, it's available. Would I necessarily practice anything if I was living in Missouri? Maybe since it's a Chabad house, I might sort of drift over there just for nostalgic reasons, but I probably wouldn't do much. But my Jewish identity remains incredibly strong and incredibly important, even if in some ways complicated.
So, as a father, I was really drawn to the story of you and your children, and I know this is a really complicated part of the book for you. Have you had any breakthroughs on rebuilding any relationships with any of your 5 children?
Well, what I'd say to that is I appreciate the question, and I get asked that a fair amount. It's now about 3 years since my book was published, but it's 8 years since I started writing the book, and my children are in a very different place, and so I've chosen actually I've chosen to make this the one question that I actually don't respond to much, or at least not with much elaboration, because my children now they're grown. 3 of them are adults, are of adult age, and the other 2 are close to adults, and my 2 oldest ones are already married and building families of their own, and so I've chosen to not get much into that area and to give them a measure of privacy. But I do appreciate the question, and I do appreciate when people express that interest in knowing. Mm-hmm. But this is the one area that I decline to go into, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, sir. So, Shulem Deen, your book, All Who Go Do Not Return, is wonderful, marvelous, heartbreaking, inspiring, all at once. And I'm curious if you can just share where people can find more about you if they'd like to know more about your work.
Oh, sure. Well, I have a website, shulemdeen.com, where you can find me. I'm on social media, just like everyone is, and hate it just as everyone does, and still addicted to it just as everyone is. So I have a Twitter account, shdeen, which you can find, which I don't use all that much. My website has information about, my book and my other writings and events that I do. I do fairly regular speaking engagements, and so I try to post them up on my events page and things like that. So shulemdeen.com is where you can find me.
This has been a real pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for spending this time with me.
Thank you, Greg. Really appreciate it.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is performed and composed by Derek Strybing. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you would like to support this show, please subscribe or leaving a rating in iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.